The trailer for the Apple original comedy film Fly Me to the Moon raises major questions, like whether NASA really hired a marketing team for Apollo 11 and if they faked the moon landing. On March 8, Sony Pictures Entertainment released the first trailer for Fly Me to the Moon. Starring Channing Tatum and Scarlett Johansson, this movie centers on a marketing specialist named Kelly Jones, who NASA hires to help get the American public on board with the organization's mission to land a man on the moon. The trailer shows Kelly's team and NASA getting increasingly desperate, eventually even filming a fake version of the moon landing in case the mission goes awry. Like many Channing Tatum movies, Fly Me to the Moon takes a comedic approach to storytelling. However, this movie also has all the hallmarks of a fictionalized true story. As such, the trailer raises questions about whether a marketing team had a hand in popularizing the Apollo 11 mission. If they really existed, it raises a further question about whether NASA really faked the moon landing. Why the American public wasn't sold on flying to the moon in the 1960s. The 1960s in the United States were fraught with violence and tension. When it is portrayed in TV shows and movies, the moon landing usually shows a large crowd watching the liftoff and the landing on their TVs and radios. That isn't a lie either. According to the National Air and Space Museum, approximately 650 million people watched Neil Armstrong become the first man to walk on the moon. However, these rarely show the doubt and uncertainty of the American public in the years between JFK's announcement and the actual moon landing. However, Fly Me to the Moon centers on the way that NASA combated this issue. As Fly Me to the Moon's preview indicates, during the 1960s, the majority of the American public was skeptical about NASA and JFK's plan to fly to the moon, via the New York Times. Part of this could be due to the newness of NASA. The organization was only signed into law in 1958. Additionally, there were more pressing issues facing people in the United States. By the time JFK made his famous moon landing speech, the Vietnam War had raged on for 7 years. Americans became vehemently opposed to the war, resulting in demonstrations that became increasingly violent. The civil rights movement was in full swing, resulting in high racial tension and deadly race riots. Though tensions settled a little in the early 1960s, citizens still faced the looming threat of nuclear war with the USSR, resulting in schoolchildren doing duck and cover drills. Additionally, between the counterculture movement, which gave rise to the hippies, and the civil rights movement, white Americans and conservatives felt that traditional American values were under attack. With all these ongoing issues, the American public felt that NASA's plans to put a man on the moon were frivolous and unnecessary. How NASA set out to educate the public and change its perception. NASA worked with its public relations office to provide journalists with educational materials. In order to gain the American public's approval for the moon landing, NASA worked with its public affairs office to create an educational campaign. Fly Me to the Moon's trailer shows an advertising company helping. However, according to the Marginal Ian, they hired ex-news reporters to work at NASA, disseminating information in an accessible way to the media. The team focused on the difference between NASA and the USSR's space program, which wouldn't publicly announce a rocket launch until after it happened. NASA developed an open-book policy when it came to the Apollo mission. In order to educate the public Public Relations Office put together 3-ring binders full of information for journalists. The information provided included diagrams of all the technology involved in the launches and how they work. NASA required that all advertisements related to the space program be submitted to them for approval prior to running them. This ensured consistently accurate information for the public. In addition to binders of information and diagrams, the Public Relations Office ensured television news programs had ample opportunities to interview the scientists involved in the moon landing.